In our Gospel reading today, we hear of the Good Shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. For some, these passages can lead to images of atonement, how Jesus became the sacrificial lamb. We hear of the wolf and the hired hands. We hear of sheep that don't belong to the fold. Useful images, perhaps. There is another image, the image that John paints, of Jesus being prepared to face danger, to face death for the sake of his disciples. And as on this ANZAC weekend, and having just working our way through Easter, it's an image that I'd like to talk about. In my last years at St John's College, I spent 3 months at Auckland Hospital completing my CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education Training. I was given responsibility for 2 wards, a general surgical and a geriatric ward on the top floor. I remember being initially a bit weary of the prospect of visiting and talking with the top floor oldies. Whilst I'd had considerable experience in working with families and children and as adults, as a therapist and counsellor, I hadn't ever worked with anyone older than their mid-50s. My only real experience of those ancient years was hospital visiting with my mother and father. Dad regularly visited in his role as an RSA committee member or as the almoner for the local Masonic lodge, handing out bars of chocolates and cigarettes, as they did in those days. Mum visited in her own capacity as born out of a practical Christianity that saw no new family arrive in town with a cake suddenly being produced, or anyone who was ill not receiving a visit, either at home or in hospital. However, it's those images of hospital that we used to visit that stayed with me, to a degree still do. The rather intimidating matrons with their crisp demeanour, only matched by the crispness of their starched cotton. The all-pervading smell of Jay's fluid, the echoing dimly lit corridors and the hushed bedside conversations. Resigned to my ward allocations, I quickly established myself in the general ward, and then 2 days later walked slowly up the stairs to the 10th floor. I guess dragging my heels a little as I didn't take the lift. I opened the ward door, scanned for the whereabouts of any crisp matrons, and made for the nearest bed. Now, the bed was occupied by a clear-eyed and rather well-looking English lady. I introduced myself, explaining that I was a student on CPE, had been ordained in the Anglican Church recently, and that I would be visiting the ward on a regular basis. Quick as a flash, she replied in a strong and precise voice, "I've had nothing to do with the church since the bishop blessed the bombers." Right, I thought. I knew wards were dangerous places, especially theologically. What do I say now? Bombers, yes, probably Lancasters, British Air Force's large aircraft that gained such a reputation for their reliability and to fly into Europe. I thought, yes, great. I just recently handed in an assignment concerning the principles and conduct of just war. Perhaps I could explore that with her. You know the theory. Let me just recap. Body of Christian thinking that sought to answer the simple question, can a Christian ever justifiably take part in violence or in war? I know, I can explain that much of what we recognise today as Christian just war tradition stems from the thinking and writing of people such as Augustine of Hippo, Ambrose of Milan, and that as the needs of the Christian states changed over time, so did the Church's response, and through councils, canon law and its own thinkers, a tradition of just war theory or doctrine was designed. Now, of course, you probably know these off by heart, but again, recap. The principles, if you are going to go to war, it better be it as a last resort. A war, a just war, can only be fought once all peaceful options have been discarded. War only as a last resort. It must be declared by proper authority. We don't want anybody going around declaring war. Must have a just cause. Self-defense or defense of others less capable of defending themselves. It must possess a right intention. The primary objective of a just war is to re-establish peace. There must be a serious and genuine prospect of success. And the end must be proportional to the means used. Right, I thought, probably not a good idea. It's a bit dry, given the situation. And just war theory does seem to be honoured more in its breach by even those nations that proclaim to be motivated by some Christian principles. After all, experience suggests that governments seem to be more motivated by a certain political realism rather than striving for moral decision-making when contemplating the waging of war. How was I to respond? Is she saying that she disregards the use of any violence as an option for humans to solve their disagreements or problems? Or is she saying that to bless a bomber was going too far, that the church had somehow gone a bridge too far and associated inappropriately with weapons of war? Perhaps blessing just the pilots might have been okay. No, I thought that was probably being a bit provocative. What else? And I thought, what did the early fathers have to say on the matter? Those who were closest in time to the life of Jesus. I sort of remembered that they didn't actually have a lot to say. But as the new church began to mature, we know that some of the patristic writers had objections to participation in war, and for very good reason. Rome at the time was persecuting Christians. And even if you could get past that, the fear of idolatry and the divided loyalties that would mean if you joined the military would have been unbearable. They were worried about the immorality of soldiers and had a very natural aversion to bloodshed. But I guess the crowning reason was their anticipation of the imminent end of earthly society and their general suspicions of the world. Perhaps I could talk about the struggles Christians had in adjusting to living within the Roman Empire. Perhaps have an imaginary dinner conversation involving perhaps a young 18-year-old Christian beseeching his family to be allowed to join the fire brigade. The anguish of the parents at the thought of their son joining the army, for it was the army in those days that provided the Rome fire brigades. No, probably not, because I could come up with just as many passages from Scripture to balance those. Then I thought, no, a quick biblical exegesis covering the main arguments for the use of violence might be appropriate here. Perhaps I could outline some of the biblical passages indicating that participation in war was not necessarily forbidden to Christians. Luke 7, the healing of the centurion's servant. The manner in which Jesus spoke of the centurion at Capernaum. I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel. And let's remember that that centurion made it very plain that he was high up the military hierarchy. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me, and I tell this one go, and he goes, and that one come, and he comes, and I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. Romans 13, that would do the trick. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. You know the passages, and Peter too. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of emperor, as supreme, or as of governors. And I reflected a little. No, I thought, better not do that. I'm not sure if this lady still regards the scriptures of any value. And if I'm to assist this woman as a chaplain, then I need to respond to her in her own situation. Perhaps I could encourage her to talk about a response to the bishop's actions. As it turned out, we had many conversations. She talked about being brought up in the faith and regularly attending and enjoying church until that moment when she heard of the bomber blessings. She remembered being shocked, not quite knowing what she was shocked about. She talked about the awfulness of what was happening in her country and in Europe. She spoke in a manner that initially indicated a confusion as to what she should think. I very quickly realized, however, that it wasn't confusion. She was very clear on many things. The evilness of war, the awfulness of losing family and friends, the fear of losing the war and what that might mean. She talked about knowing that someone had to stop Hitler, that someone had to fight. She knew that her people needed to apply every energy to winning and waging this war. But she also spoke of how a village vicar who'd been part of her life and her family's life since her birth, and of the same bishop who had confirmed her, and of the church that appeared to abhor violence. And here it was, blessing the bombers. Would they be blessing individual bombs next? She spoke of the turmoil that these conflicting emotions stirred in her. There seemed not confusion, but to be a deep sort of metaphysical turmoil. How to reconcile the message of peace and love to the reality of what was happening around her and her family. But those conversations were yet to come. And I thought, perhaps I could talk about my own thoughts and feelings concerning participation in war, about how I joined the army as an 18-year-old and how I remembered being disappointed at missing out on Vietnam. The last draft headed out to Vietnam a week after I arrived at Waiouru to begin basic training. I could tell her about my gratefulness years later at not going to Vietnam. I could talk about the awful things that happened in that war. I could talk about my sons, who I hoped would never have to fight, and yet knowing that I would be immensely proud if any of them did join the military. I could talk about how to balance pride and fear at the same time. As it turned out, one of my sons did join up, trained as a mortarman and as a peacekeeper, subsequently serving in that capacity in the Solomons. And I know from a fellow St. John's student how grateful the Solomon Islanders were at the presence of our soldiers, the real difference the peacekeeping forces made in their lives. I could talk about the traditional blessing of colours. Yes, blessing of colours, that would probably work. The regimental flags and guidons of the military unit, how those colours help develop and maintain esprit de corps to the members of that unit, especially important when feelings of loyalties and responsibilities to a common group are so important. And sort of warming to my theme, I realised that aircraft and guns were in fact the colours of the Air Force and the artillery. I could talk about how I would struggle to bless personal weapons, how I could and have blessed individual items such as panamu, how I have thought when asked to bless a panamu meri, is this the thing that I should be doing? Well, yeah. that moment, I've had nothing to do with the church since the bishop blessed the bombers. What could I say? Well, I didn't really say anything. I just said, aha. Not the condemning sort of, aha. Or the collegial questioning, aha. She replied with a sort of a sound, not the condemning sort of or a let's take this a little further. And we did for the next few days, talking much about the stuff we've just talked about and much more. The big thing I remember is talking about how important it was to talk of these things, to agree, perhaps to disagree, and yet despite differing points of view at times, we knew we held common hopes and could pray as one about the same things. All this and more we talked about. And then one day, she was gone. Amen.